I am Iman, 29 years old, and a forensic accountant. I rushed into my family home, clutching a winning $32 million Florida lotto ticket, ready to forgive a lifetime of cruelty and share my newfound wealth. Before I could even catch my breath, my stepmother pointed to my belongings stuffed into garbage bags and told me to get out. Then my arrogant brother-in-law slid a legal document across the kitchen island, demanding I sign away my home. I stayed completely silent, scribbled a fake name, and walked out the door with my millions. The next day, they saw my face on the evening news and realized the monumental mistake they had just made. Let me know where you are watching from in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button if you love seeing toxic people get exactly what they deserve. The Florida heat was suffocating that afternoon, but I barely felt it. My hands were shaking against the steering wheel of my beat-up car. Tucked safely inside the center console was a small slip of paper that was about to change my entire existence. $32 million. I had checked the numbers 6 times at the gas station and another 10 times in the parking lot. My mind was racing with possibilities. For years, my family dynamic had been strained, toxic, and exhausting. But in that moment of pure elation, I wanted to fix it. I wanted to pay off my father's debts, send my half-sister Brielle on a luxury vacation, and finally earn the respect of my stepmother Valerie. I genuinely believed this wealth could act as a reset button for all of us. I parked in the driveway of the sprawling estate my late biological mother had poured her heart into. I ran up the porch steps, practically vibrating with excitement, ready to shout the news, but the moment I pushed open the heavy front door, the words died in my throat. Lining the expensive hardwood floor of the entryway were 6 heavy-duty black garbage bags. They were not filled with yard waste or old donations. Sitting right on top of the closest bag was my college diploma, my winter coats, and the framed photograph of my late mother that usually sat on my nightstand. Before I could process the shock, Valerie walked out of the formal dining room. She was wearing her pristine tennis outfit, pearls resting perfectly against her collarbone. She did not flinch when she saw the devastation on my face. She simply crossed her arms and let out a tired sigh. "Grab those bags and make sure you do not drag them across the wood floors," Valerie said, her voice completely devoid of emotion. "Connor and Brielle are moving their things in this weekend. The hotel they wanted was fully booked for the season, and they need space. Your room is Brielle's now. You are almost 30 years old, Iman. It is time you figure your own life out. You packed my entire life into garbage bags without even calling me." I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "I live here." A loud, obnoxious laugh echoed from the top of the stairs. Connor, my half-sister's white husband, descended the staircase, tossing a metal measuring tape between his hands. He wore his signature smug smile, the one he always used when he was about to explain the world to me. "Do not look so shocked, Iman." Connor chuckled, shaking his head as if I were a confused toddler. "You have been paying off those massive student loans for that basic accounting degree for years now. It is time to face reality. You cannot afford to stay in a neighborhood like this anyway." His words were a deliberate, calculated strike. Connor knew exactly why I was drowning in student loans. While Valerie and my father David had gladly paid out of pocket for Brielle's expensive out-of-state tuition and her lavish wedding, they had completely cut me off financially the second I turned 18. They refused to contribute a single dime to my education at Howard University, forcing me to take on predatory loans to survive. And now Connor was using the very financial struggle they created to justify throwing me out onto the street. I reached into my pocket, my fingers grazing the crisp edge of the lottery ticket. I wanted to tell them I could buy this entire neighborhood 10 times over. But before I could speak, Connor walked past the garbage bags and slapped a thick stack of papers onto the marble kitchen island. "Since you are leaving, we need to tidy up some loose ends," Connor said, leaning against the counter with an air of unearned authority. "Your dad asked me to handle the real estate technicalities since this is my area of expertise. We need you to sign this quitclaim deed. It simply relinquishes your minority stake in the property. It is strictly for tax simplification purposes, so your dad does not get hit with heavy penalties this quarter. Come on, sign it, and you can get out of our hair." He held out a fancy silver pen, expecting me to blindly obey. As a commercial real estate broker, Connor always assumed he was the smartest person in the room, especially when talking to me. He relied heavily on his privilege, using legal jargon to intimidate and confuse. I walked slowly toward the island, my eyes fixed on the document. I did not need him to explain what a quitclaim deed was. As a forensic data analyst, I dealt with complex financial and legal documents every single day. I looked down at the paper, reading the fine print. But what caught my immediate attention was the reference date buried in the second paragraph, 2007. Ooh. My breath caught in my chest, but I kept my face completely blank. 2007 was not a random year. It was the exact year my biological mother placed this entire estate into an irrevocable trust. She did it specifically to protect my future, ensuring that the house would completely bypass my father and legally belong to me once I came of age. I scribbled a fake signature, grabbed my bags, and walked out silently to execute my ultimate financial revenge, completely undetected. I dragged the heavy black plastic bags down the pristine brick walkway of the driveway. The afternoon heat was absolutely brutal, but the chill in my chest kept me perfectly numb. Behind me, the heavy mahogany front door clicked open. My father, David, slipped out onto the porch, looking over his shoulder to make sure Valerie was not watching. He scurried down the steps like a frightened child. He reached into his perfectly tailored slacks and pulled out two crumpled $100 bills. "Just for a motel tonight, sweetheart," he whispered, shoving the money toward my hand. "Please do not make your stepmother angry. She has been under a lot of stress with the country club board elections coming up." I stared at the money and then at the man who was supposed to protect me. "You are letting another man hand me an eviction notice in my own home," I said, my voice dead calm. "You are letting Connor kick me out so Brielle can have a massive walk-in closet." My father refused to meet my gaze. He looked at the manicured lawn, then at his expensive loafers. "You are 29, Iman," he mumbled. "You are old enough to figure this out. Connor knows what he is doing with the property taxes. Just let it go for the sake of peace." "Keep your money, David," I told him, turning my back. "You are going to need it." I popped the trunk of my beat-up Honda Civic and shoved the garbage bags inside. Before getting into the driver's seat, I stopped and looked up at the massive Florida estate. My eyes traced the intricate white wooden columns lining the wraparound porch. I remembered being 7 years old, watching my biological mother carefully paint those exact columns. She had bought this house with her own hard-earned money long before David ever moved in. She painted those columns white to symbolize a fresh start. When she got sick and passed away, my entire world shattered. David married Valerie barely 8 months later, and they immediately started acting like my mother's house was their personal kingdom. From the day Valerie moved in with her spoiled daughter Brielle, I became the invisible help. I was the one expected to clean up after Brielle's parties and stay out of sight when Valerie's high society friends came over. They stripped away every piece of my mother they could find, except those columns. I did not shed a single tear as I started the engine. Tears were for people who had lost. I had not lost anything today. I had simply gathered the data I needed to destroy them. I pulled out of the neighborhood, leaving behind the security gates and the perfectly trimmed hedges. My mind was completely clear. As a forensic data analyst, I was trained to look for discrepancies, to track the numbers, and to expose fraud. Emotion had no place in my line of work. Strategy was everything. I drove straight downtown to the law offices of Maxine Willis. Maxine and I had met years ago when she needed an accountant to trace hidden assets in a messy corporate embezzlement case. She was a brilliant Howard University law graduate with sharp instincts and zero tolerance for nonsense. We had been close friends ever since. I bypassed her receptionist and walked straight into her corner office. Maxine looked up from her paperwork, pushing her stylish reading glasses up into her neatly styled locks. "You look like you just survived a hurricane," she noted, putting her pen down. "What happened?" I walked over to her heavy mahogany desk and placed two items gently on the polished surface. First, I laid down my phone screen, brightly displaying the photo I had snapped of the quitclaim deed Connor had tried to force me to sign. Second, I placed the lottery ticket right next to it. Read the numbers I said, taking a seat in the leather chair opposite her. Then look at the document on my phone. Maxine picked up the lottery ticket first. She glanced at it, then looked at her computer screen, where the winning numbers were currently plastered across every local news homepage. Her jaw dropped. Iman. She gasped, her eyes wide with absolute shock. Are you telling me you hold the $32 million ticket? I nodded, leaning back in the chair, feeling the weight of the day finally settle. Now look at the photo, I told her. Look at what my arrogant brother-in-law tried to make me sign 20 minutes ago. Maxine picked up my phone and zoomed in on the image of the document. The shock on her face quickly transformed into a sharp, predatory smile. She let out a loud, echoing laugh that filled the entire office. This idiot, she chuckled, shaking her head in disbelief. Connor used a standard internet template for a quitclaim deed. He did not even bother to consult a real attorney. He just filled in the blanks and thought his unearned confidence would force you to sign it blindly. But why is it funny, I asked, knowing the answer but wanting to hear my lawyer confirm my suspicions. Maxine leaned forward, resting her elbows on the desk. Because not only is this document completely void against a 2007 irrevocable trust, but by attempting to force you to sign away a property that legally belongs to you, they have committed attempted real estate fraud. Your mother locked that house up tight. No one can touch it. But Connor thinks he is the smartest guy in the room. I smiled, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction warming my chest. Exactly, I said. Connor thinks I am just a broke accountant who does not understand property law. He thinks he just evicted me. Maxine started typing furiously on her keyboard. We are going to let him keep thinking that, she said, her eyes fixed on the screen. I am setting up a blind corporate trust right now. We are going to claim this $32 million entirely anonymously. Your family will have absolutely no idea you possess this wealth until we are ready to strike. We will secure your funds and then we will drop the hammer on their little real estate scam. 2 days passed in absolute silence from my end. Back at the estate, Valerie was already celebrating her perceived victory. On Thursday evening, she hosted a lavish dinner party for her high society friends. The wealthy country club elite were all in attendance for the evening. Connor stood by the massive marble fireplace holding a glass of aged bourbon. He puffed his chest out, leaning heavily into his unearned white privilege as he bragged about his real estate prowess to anyone who would listen. He told the local politicians he had just restructured a major family asset to protect his father-in-law from heavy tax liabilities. He painted himself as the absolute savior of the estate, completely omitting the part where he handed a fake quitclaim deed to his black sister-in-law and tried to force her onto the street like a stray dog. He smiled his arrogant signature smile, soaking up the excessive praise from the incredibly wealthy friends of Valerie. Brielle sat on the custom velvet sofa holding a glass of champagne, surrounded by the wives of the country club board members. She took a delicate sip and complained loudly about me telling the other women how glad she was that I was finally gone for good. She said I always ruined the aesthetic of the family with my thrifted clothes and boring accounting books. This was the action-based backstory of my entire existence in that house. The words of Brielle proved exactly how deeply superficial their bond truly was. They did not care about my well-being. They only cared about how my presence affected their country club image and carefully curated aesthetic. I was nothing more than an ugly blemish on their perfect painting, and they were absolutely thrilled to finally scrub me out forever. Valerie glided through the room like a queen surveying her kingdom, wearing a stunning emerald green gown adorned with sparkling diamonds she had coerced my father into buying. She stopped by the group announcing that the East Wing would be completely remodeled. She framed my eviction as a necessary upgrade, erasing the fact that I had lived in that room since I was a little girl. David, my biological father, sat quietly in a leather armchair in the dark corner nursing a glass of wine. He heard every cruel word his wife and daughter said about me, but did absolutely nothing at all to stop them. He enabled their toxicity to keep his own peace, choosing the comfort of the high society life over his own flesh and blood. The hired private chef began serving the third course, carrying silver trays of seared Wagyu beef into the formal dining room. Valerie directed everyone to their assigned seats, ensuring that Connor sat at the head of the table opposite David. As the guests settled, the massive 85-inch television in the adjoining living room continued to play softly. It was exactly 6 in the evening. The local news anchor appeared on the screen with a serious expression. A breaking news graphic flashing brightly across the screen caught the eye of a curious guest. The anchor announced a major update regarding the historic $32 million Florida Lotto jackpot. Connor chuckled, taking a bite of his steak and loudly remarking that whoever won that money would go bankrupt within a year because ordinary people do not understand wealth. Valerie increased the volume, feeling a twinge of jealousy that someone else was suddenly richer than her entire social circle. The news anchor explained that the $32 million prize had been officially claimed earlier that afternoon. The funds were secured through a highly sophisticated corporate trust designed to protect the privacy of the winner. However, the anchor continued, due to transparency laws, the sole beneficiary representative of the corporate trust had to be publicly named. The screen transitioned from the face of the news anchor to a high-resolution photograph. It was the professional headshot I used for my forensic accounting firm. The anchor clearly read my full legal name and stated that I was the sole owner of the corporate trust holding the $32 million ticket. My face flashed bright and clear across the screen. The entire dining room plunged into a suffocating absolute silence. The only sound was the voice of the news anchor continuing to detail the massive financial payout. Valerie stood frozen at the head of the table, the remote control slipping from her manicured fingers. She was holding her favorite crystal wine glass in her left hand. Her face turned an ashen shade of gray as the reality of the broadcast slammed into her perfectly curated world. Her fingers went completely limp. The crystal wine glass slipped from her grasp and plummeted toward the hardwood floor. It hit the ground with a sharp, violent crack, shattering into 100 glittering pieces across the expensive wood. The dark red wine splashed across the hem of her emerald gown, looking like fresh blood. Across the table, Connor had just taken a large gulp of his expensive bourbon. As my face filled the television screen, his throat completely locked up. He choked violently on his drink, his face turning a blotchy shade of purple as he coughed and sputtered, trying to clear his airway. He pounded his chest desperately, staring at the screen with wide, panicked eyes. The arrogant commercial broker suddenly realized he had handed an eviction notice to a woman holding $32 million. At that exact second, breaking through the sounds of the violent coughing of Connor and the steady voice of the news anchor, a phone began to ring. It was a loud, obnoxious ringtone piercing the thick tension in the room. Every head at the dining table slowly turned toward the corner of the room. David was still sitting in his leather armchair, his face completely devoid of color. He reached into his pocket with trembling fingers and pulled out his cell phone. He stared at the glowing screen, his breathing shallow and rapid. The caller ID flashed bright and clear in the dim lighting of the corner. It was me, Iman. I was calling him right at the exact moment my face appeared on the television screen. I sat in my quiet apartment, miles away, listening to the rhythmic tone, picturing the absolute terror spreading across my father's face. My face was still frozen on their massive television screen, broadcasting my new reality to everyone they desperately wanted to impress. David finally answered the call, but he did not speak right away. I heard the shaky breath he drew in. I heard the unmistakable sound of him pressing the speakerphone button so the entire room could hear. "Hello, Iman," he managed to say, his voice cracking under the weight of his own guilt and sudden realization. He sounded like a man who had just watched his world crumble. I did not say hello back. I just listened to the heavy breathing of the high society guests and the frantic rustling of expensive fabric in the background. Before my father could formulate another sentence, Valerie snatched the narrative. The woman who had thrown me out onto the street just 2 days ago suddenly burst into dramatic theatrical tears. Oh, our sweet girl! Valerie sobbed, her voice trembling with an expertly crafted fake sorrow. Iman, sweetheart, we have been so worried about you. You left in such a hurry the other day. We have been trying to reach you everywhere. Please tell me you are safe. Her performance was utterly nauseating. She wailed over the speakerphone, calling me her precious daughter and claiming that the entire eviction had been a terrible misunderstanding. She told her wealthy friends that she and David had simply wanted to remodel my room as a surprise and that Connor had just brought the wrong paperwork by mistake. She spun a beautiful web of lies, painting herself as a loving, worried mother who was desperate to bring her suddenly rich stepdaughter back home. I sat at my kitchen island, tapping my fingers against the cool granite countertop, listening to her weave this pathetic delusion. She actually thought the promise of a fake family reunion would make me forget a lifetime of cruelty. She thought $32 million would buy her a clean slate and erase the decades of abuse I suffered under her roof. I let her cry for another solid minute before I finally spoke. My voice was calm, cold, and completely detached from the hysterical performance she was giving. "Stop crying, Valerie," I said, cutting through the thick layer of her fake grief. "There was no misunderstanding. You did not pack my room for a surprise remodel. You packed my entire life into heavy black trash bags because you wanted to erase me from the estate." I could hear the sharp gasps of the dinner guests in the background, but I did not stop. I told the entire room exactly what Valerie had done. I described how I opened the first garbage bag in my trunk and found my late mother's vintage clothes crumpled at the very bottom. I detailed how Valerie had taken my mother's hand-beaded silk dresses, the ones that still smelled like lavender, the ones she wore to church every Sunday, and shoved them into plastic bags alongside discarded junk. Those were not just clothes, I explained, my voice echoing through their silent dining room. Those were the only physical pieces of my biological mother I had left in this world. Valerie knew that. She knew exactly what those dresses meant to me, and she tossed them in the trash without a single second of hesitation, just to make room for Brielle's ridiculous shoe collection. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. I knew Valerie was standing there humiliated in front of her elite friends, unable to defend her own cruelty because she knew I had the evidence. Suddenly, the sound of scuffling came through the speaker. Connor had snatched the phone away from David. He cleared his throat, trying to regain his position as the dominant authority figure in the room. "Iman, listen to me very carefully," Connor said, his tone dripping with an arrogant, patronizing confidence. $32 million is a massive amount of capital for someone with your background to handle. You are going to be completely overwhelmed. The IRS will eat you alive with luxury taxes and capital gains penalties before you even see a fraction of that money. You need a professional to protect you. He paused, expecting me to feel grateful for his sudden intervention. "I know we had our differences the other day," he continued, brushing past his attempt to steal my house like it was a minor traffic violation. "But let me bring you into my commercial brokerage firm. I can set up a diversified portfolio for you. We can look into asset allocation and tax shelters. I will manage the money and make sure it is invested properly. You need someone who understands high-level finance, Iman, someone with real-world experience. You cannot do this alone with just a basic accounting degree." I leaned back in my chair and let out a soft, genuine laugh. The audacity of this man trying to mansplain wealth management to a black woman who tracked hidden corporate assets for a living was astonishing. "Manage my money, Connor?" I asked, allowing a hint of dark amusement to seep into my voice. "Are you seriously offering to manage a $32 million corporate trust?" "Yes, absolutely," he replied quickly, sensing a glimmer of hope. "I can handle the entire portfolio." I took a slow, deep breath before delivering the fatal blow. "You want to manage my money exactly like how you managed your own commercial brokerage firm into a $1.2 million deficit?" I asked brightly. I heard Brielle let out a sharp, confused gasp in the background. Connor went completely silent. "You see, Connor," I continued, my voice dropping to a dangerous clinical whisper, "forensic accountants do not just look at spreadsheets. We read public bankruptcy filings, too. I know all about the offshore shell companies and the massive debt you have been hiding from Brielle and Valerie. You are completely broke, Connor. You are drowning in liabilities, and you thought you could use my mother's house to bail yourself out of a massive hole. I did not wait for his response. I pressed the end call button, dropping the phone onto my kitchen island. I sat alone in the quiet of my apartment, knowing that I had just detonated a financial bomb in the middle of their perfect dinner party, leaving Connor pale, exposed, and completely ruined. The next afternoon, I sat in a plush leather booth at the Oakmont Country Club dining room across from Maxine. The atmosphere was exactly what you would expect from a place that charged a $50,000 initiation fee. Crystal chandeliers hung low over tables covered in crisp white linen, and the air smelled faintly of expensive perfume and roasted garlic. Maxine and I were reviewing the final documents for the corporate trust. I was finally feeling a sense of peace. That peace shattered the moment a shadow fell across our table. I did not even have to look up to know who it was. The overwhelming scent of Valerie's signature floral perfume hit me first. I raised my eyes to see my stepmother standing there with Brielle and Connor flanking her like heavily armed guards. Valerie wore a bright pink silk blouse and a wide, desperate smile that looked completely unnatural on her face. Before I could even ask why they were tracking me down, Valerie slid into the booth right next to me, sliding her expensive handbag onto the table. Brielle and Connor grabbed chairs from an empty table nearby and forced their way into our private meeting. Valerie immediately reached across the table and grabbed a menu out of my hands. She flagged down a passing waiter with a loud snap of her fingers. My stepdaughter will just have the house-side salad with dressing on the side, and a tap water, Valerie announced loudly to the waiter, making sure the neighboring tables could hear her. She is on a very strict budget and we do not want her stretching her finances today. I will cover her little salad, of course. My jaw tightened, but I kept my breathing perfectly steady. This was exactly how Valerie had treated me my entire life. She constantly infantilized me in public, ordering the cheapest items for me, and loudly offering to pay so everyone would view her as a charitable savior, taking care of her poor, helpless stepdaughter. It was a calculated tactic designed to make me feel small and dependent. In the past, I would have lowered my head and eaten the dry lettuce just to avoid a scene. But today was entirely different. I calmly raised my hand and signaled the waiter to remain at the table. "I will not be having the side salad," I told the waiter, keeping my voice smooth and perfectly polite. "Instead, I will start with the beluga caviar service and the wagyu beef carpaccio. For my main course, I will have the butter-poached lobster, and please bring a bottle of your best vintage champagne for my lawyer and me to share." Valerie's fake smile froze on her face. Her eyes darted from me to the waiter and then to the menu, realizing that the items I just ordered totaled well over $600. Brielle let out a loud, dramatic scoff, leaning back in her chair and crossing her arms. She muttered something under her breath about me being incredibly irresponsible with money. Connor leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and tried to put on his serious business face. "Iman, you really need to listen to reason," Connor said, lowering his voice into that condescending tone he loved to use. "You cannot just go around ordering caviar because you had a stroke of luck. That money needs to be parked in a secure growth fund. Real estate is the only tangible asset class that matters right now." I was actually looking at a commercial strip mall development this morning that would be the perfect vehicle for your capital. I completely ignored him. I did not look at him or acknowledge his presence. I simply turned my attention back to Maxine, who was organizing a stack of financial portfolios on the table. "Maxine, I think we should aggressively pursue high-yield municipal bonds for the first quarter," I said, tapping a pen against the financial projections. "Given the current tax environment, we can leverage the municipal bonds to offset the capital gains from the initial trust payout. It provides a tax-exempt revenue stream that will secure the principal while giving us the liquidity we need for future commercial acquisitions." Maxine nodded in agreement without looking at Connor either. "That is exactly what I was thinking," Iman, Maxine replied. "We can structure the bond purchases through the secondary holding company to maximize the tax shield. The yield curve is highly favorable right now, especially in the infrastructure sector." Connor tried to interject again, clearing his throat loudly and waving his hand. "Wait a minute, Iman," he stammered, his face turning a blotchy red. "Municipal bonds are a terrible play right now. You are missing out on double-digit returns in the private equity sector. My firm can give you access to exclusive real estate syndications that normal retail investors never see." I took a slow sip of my ice water, keeping my eyes locked on Maxine. It is fascinating how people with seven-figure corporate deficits try to give investment advice, I said casually to my lawyer. It is almost as if they think screaming buzzwords will magically erase their public bankruptcy filings. Maxine let out a soft chuckle and flipped to the next page of our contract. "It really is a marvel of human psychology, Iman," she agreed. Connor slumped back in his chair, looking like he had just been physically struck. The color drained entirely from his face as he realized I was not going to let him forget that I knew exactly how deeply in debt he truly was. Brielle, however, possessed none of her husband's shame. She slammed her hands flat against the white tablecloth, making the silverware rattle. "You owe us!" Brielle shouted, her voice shrill and echoing across the quiet dining room. Other wealthy patrons turned their heads to stare at the commotion, but Brielle did not care. "You owe us this money, Iman," she yelled. "Connor and I need capital for our new house. We are suffocating in debt because of his stupid business, and you are sitting here ordering caviar when you should be helping your own family." Valerie desperately tried to shush her daughter, grabbing her arm and casting panicked looks around the country club. She knew her precious high society reputation was currently going up in flames. She begged Brielle to lower her voice, but the damage was already done. The elegant illusion Valerie had spent years building was completely shattered. Right on cue, the waiter approached our table, carrying a small black leather book. He placed the bill gently in the center of the table, right between me and Connor. The total was exactly $840. I stood up from the booth and picked up my designer handbag. I looked down at the pathetic trio sitting at the table. I reached out and slowly slid the black leather book directly in front of Connor. "You are the big wealth manager," I said, my voice carrying clearly over the quiet whispers of the surrounding tables. "You pay the bill." Maxine gathered her documents and stood up beside me. We turned our backs on them and walked toward the exit of the restaurant without a single backward glance. I did not need to look back to know that Connor was staring at an $800 check he absolutely could not afford to pay, while his wife threw a tantrum and his mother-in-law watched her social status evaporate into thin air. By the time I woke up the next morning, my phone was vibrating endlessly on my nightstand. Valerie and Brielle had absolutely wasted no time. Furious about the public humiliation at the country club, they launched a massive coordinated attack online. Brielle posted a highly edited, tearful video on her social media pages that already had hundreds of thousands of views. She sat in her plush remodeled bedroom, wearing a simple sweater to look relatable, dabbing her dry eyes and painting me as a greedy, bitter monster. She told her massive following of local socialites that I had won the lottery in secret and immediately abandoned the family who loved and raised me. Valerie took it a step further by calling the local high society bloggers and neighborhood gossips. She spun a pathetic narrative claiming that they had always treated me like a literal princess and that my sudden wealth had turned me into a heartless, cruel villain. They accused me of leaving them with massive restaurant bills and laughing at their financial struggles in public. The smear campaign was swift, vicious, and entirely predictable. My inbox flooded with angry messages from distant relatives I had not spoken to in several years. Aunts and uncles who never bothered to call on my birthday were suddenly leaving aggressive voicemails calling me a sellout and a disgrace to the family name. The local country club wives shared the video Brielle made, writing long paragraphs about how ungrateful I was after everything Valerie had supposedly done for me. I sat at my kitchen island drinking my black coffee, watching the hate roll in on my screen, but I did not shed a single tear. I had seen this exact tactic before. This was the exact same playbook Valerie used 20 years ago when she first moved into our house. Back then, she slowly turned my biological father's side of the family against my mother, whispering toxic lies at family gatherings and painting my mother as a cold, unfeeling woman. She isolated my mother from everyone she loved until the stress literally made her sick. Valerie thought she could use that same psychological warfare to break me down and force me to hand over the money. She wanted me to feel so entirely isolated and despised by the community that I would crawl back and beg for their forgiveness. She severely underestimated my professional training and my complete lack of emotional attachment to her fake world. While they were busy performing for the internet, crying their fake tears, and rallying the country club wives, I was sitting in the secure corner conference room at the law offices of Maxine Willis. I turned my phone completely off and shoved it deep into my leather tote bag. We had much more important things to do than worry about the desperate gossip of bored suburban housewives. Maxine and I had spent the entire weekend digging deep into the financial records of David, Valerie Connor, and Brielle. As forensic accountants and corporate lawyers, we knew exactly how to track the hidden paper trail of desperate, greedy people. We pulled years of property tax records, bank statements, credit reports, and obscure shell company filings linked to the Florida estate. We needed to know exactly why Connor was so incredibly desperate to get me to sign that fake quitclaim deed just 2 days before I won the lottery. The numbers we found were completely chaotic and deeply disturbing. Maxine traced a series of massive, erratic wire transfers, moving from the personal savings accounts of David directly into the failing commercial brokerage firm Connor ran downtown. David had been quietly draining his own retirement funds for months, trying to keep the sinking ship of his arrogant son-in-law afloat. Valerie was entirely obsessed with maintaining the grand illusion of immense wealth, and she had clearly forced David to secretly fund the extravagant lifestyle of Brielle and Connor, so her friends would not suspect they were broke. But the retirement accounts of my father were completely empty now. The cash had dried up completely 3 months ago, leaving them with nothing but mounting bills. Yet Connor had miraculously paid off a massive outstanding business loan just last week. The math simply did not make any sense to anyone who understood basic accounting. Money does not just appear out of thin air when all your accounts are severely overdrawn. Maxine typed furiously on her dual monitors, cross-referencing the exact dates of the sudden loan payoff with public property records and banking registries. Her fingers suddenly stopped moving across the keyboard. She let out a sharp, heavy breath and leaned incredibly close to the glowing screen. "Iman," she said, her voice dropping to a low, heavy whisper that made the hairs on my arms stand up. "Look at this right now." I walked around the heavy mahogany desk and stared at the digital document she had just uncovered on the county clerk database. My heart turned to absolute ice in my chest as my eyes scanned the legal terminology. David did not just try to trick me into signing away my house with a fake quitclaim deed. That clumsy document Connor shoved in my face was only a desperate cover-up for a crime that had already happened. The horrifying truth was staring right at me in harsh black and white text. 6 weeks ago, my biological father had illegally taken out a $500,000 mortgage against the Florida estate to pay off the failing business debts of Connor. He had blatantly forged my signature on the official loan documents using the historic house that my dead mother had placed in a strict, irrevocable trust just for me as collateral. My own father had committed massive federal bank fraud to save the husband of his spoiled stepdaughter, and he was fully prepared to let me lose my home to cover their tracks. We were still staring at the damning screen when the heavy oak doors of Maxine's corner office violently swung open. The sudden noise echoed off the high ceilings as David, Valerie, and Connor marched into the room completely uninvited. They were accompanied by an older man in a cheap, shiny suit who reeked of stale cigarette smoke and sleazy desperation. Valerie led the charge, wearing her oversized designer sunglasses indoors like a ridiculous celebrity trying to avoid the paparazzi. She marched right up to the desk, pointing her manicured finger directly at my face. She loudly demanded that I immediately transfer 50% of the lottery winnings into their joint family account. Valerie claimed that because I had lived under her roof and ate her food, the money legally and morally belonged to the entire family. She completely ignored the fact that she had literally just thrown me out into the street like garbage. She ranted about how much she had sacrificed to raise me and how I owed her for putting up with my difficult attitude all these years. The sleazy lawyer stepped forward, slamming a battered leather briefcase onto the polished mahogany desk. He puffed out his chest and threatened to sue me for everything I had, based on the quitclaim deed Connor had tried to force me to sign. He confidently stated that the deed gave them equitable claim to all my current and future assets, including the lottery winnings. Connor was not satisfied letting the lawyer do all the talking. He stepped right up to the edge of the desk, placing his hands flat on the smooth wood and leaning his entire body weight forward. He was actively trying to use his physical presence to intimidate two black women in their own professional space. He leaned heavily into his unearned white privilege, speaking to us slowly and loudly, as if we were uneducated children who could not comprehend basic economics. Connor arrogantly quoted several entirely irrelevant property laws, claiming he was the absolute savior of the black family estate. He told Maxine that he was simply protecting the legacy of the neighborhood by restructuring the assets, and that I was too ignorant and emotional to understand his highly complex financial strategies. He went on a long-winded tangent about asset diversification and portfolio management, acting as if he was gifting us with his superior intellect. He smirked and told Maxine she was completely out of her depth in dealing with a sum of this magnitude. He actually suggested she advise her client to surrender the funds quietly before his powerful legal connections made things incredibly difficult for our little accounting firm. The absolute audacity of this mediocre commercial broker trying to lecture a brilliant Howard University law graduate about property rights was both disgusting and deeply pathetic. Maxine did not even blink. She slowly stood up, smoothing the front of her tailored blazer with absolute calm. She looked at the sleazy lawyer and began to clinically dissect his entire argument piece by piece. Maxine did not raise her voice once, but her words cut through the room like a scalpel. She calmly recited the exact trust codes, state statutes, and federal banking regulations, proving that a generic downloaded internet quitclaim deed held absolutely zero legal weight against a generational irrevocable trust. She broke down the specific legal precedents that protected my mother's assets from any external claims whatsoever. She casually informed the sleazy lawyer that presenting a document he knew was obtained through coercion and fraudulent misrepresentation was grounds for immediate disbarment. She rattled off his specific bar association violations with such terrifying precision that the man actually took a physical step backward, his face turning a sickly shade of pale. He grabbed the handle of his battered briefcase and looked at Connor with absolute panic in his eyes, suddenly realizing he had been dragged into a massive federal crime by an arrogant idiot who had no idea what he was actually doing. The room grew incredibly quiet as the reality of Maxine's legal beatdown settled over the intruders. Valerie crossed her arms tightly over her chest, her confident facade beginning to violently crumble as she looked back and forth between the terrified lawyer and my completely unbothered lawyer. Connor stood there with his mouth slightly open, unable to formulate a single coherent response to the absolute destruction of his grand legal strategy. His face was a bright shade of crimson as the humiliation finally registered in his brain. But I was not finished. The anger burning inside my chest was completely cold and perfectly focused. I turned my attention away from the arrogant stepbrother and the sleazy hired muscle. I looked directly at David. My biological father was cowering near the doorway, trying to make himself look as small and invisible as possible. He had let his wife and his stepson lead the attack, hoping he could just reap the financial rewards without getting his hands dirty. He had stood silently while they threatened me and insulted my intelligence just like he always did. I reached into my heavy leather tote bag and pulled out the freshly printed county clerk records we had just uncovered. The thick stack of papers felt incredibly heavy with the weight of his ultimate betrayal. I looked at the man who was supposed to protect me, the man who had stood by while his new family treated me like absolute garbage for 20 years. You thought you could use my dead mother's house to bail out a failing business. I said, my voice completely devoid of any emotion as I stared into his terrified eyes. You thought you could desecrate the only thing she left me just to keep Valerie and her spoiled children living in luxury while you threw me out on the street. David began to violently shake his eyes, darting toward the door like a trapped animal desperate to escape the consequences of his actions. I placed my hand flat on the top of the papers and slid the document directly across the smooth surface of the desk, stopping it right in front of his trembling hands. "You committed wire fraud and title fraud." "Dad," I told him, watching the last remaining drops of color drain from his face as he realized his life was completely over. "You forged the signature of my dead mother on those loan documents. The bank is foreclosing on the house tomorrow morning because you defaulted." The heavy silence that followed my statement was absolute and suffocating. The sleazy lawyer did not waste a single second. He practically scrambled over his own feet, grabbing his battered briefcase and sprinting out of the conference room without saying another word to the clients who had just implicated him in a massive federal crime. As the heavy oak doors swung shut behind the fleeing lawyer, the fragile alliance between my toxic family members completely shattered into a million pieces. Valerie was the first to break the silence. She let out a high-pitched noise that sounded like a wounded animal. She whipped her head around to stare at David, her oversized designer sunglasses sliding down her nose. The pristine, carefully curated mask of the wealthy suburban socialite melted away, revealing the terrified, greedy woman underneath. She marched right up to my biological father and shoved him hard in the chest. She screamed at him, demanding to know if what I had just said was true. Valerie had spent the last 2 decades treating me like absolute garbage because she believed David possessed endless generational wealth. She demanded to know how he could possibly be broke when he had promised her that the historic Florida estate would fund their luxurious retirement. David could not even look his wife in the eye. He stared down at his expensive leather shoes, his hands shaking uncontrollably as he stammered out a pathetic string of excuses. He told Valerie that Connor had promised to pay the mortgage back before the bank ever noticed. He said it was just a bridge loan to cover a temporary cash flow problem. The moment the words left his mouth, the focus of the room violently shifted. Brielle slowly turned to look at her husband. Her face was completely drained of color as the reality of the situation finally penetrated her spoiled, entitled brain. She stared at Connor as if she was looking at a complete stranger. She demanded to know why he needed a $500,000 loan from her stepfather when he was supposedly managing one of the most successful commercial brokerages in the city. Brielle had spent years bragging on social media about the massive deals Connor was closing and the extravagant lifestyle they were building. She asked him where all the money was going. Connor did not cower or apologize like David did. Instead, the arrogant smirk returned to his face, but this time it was twisted and malicious. He let out a harsh, cruel laugh that echoed through the quiet conference room. He leaned back against the wall and crossed his arms, looking at his wife with absolute disgust. He told Brielle that his brokerage had not closed a profitable deal in over 3 years. He confessed that he was entirely buried under a mountain of business debt totaling over $1.2 million. He admitted that the $500,000 he stole from David barely even covered the aggressive interest payments he owed to his private lenders. Brielle began to hyperventilate, clutching her chest as she realized her entire marriage was a complete financial sham. She screamed at Connor, asking him how he could lie to her and use her family like a personal piggy bank. Connor simply rolled his eyes and fired back with a truth that completely destroyed her reality. He told Brielle he only married her because she constantly bragged about the millions of dollars her stepfather was supposedly hiding in private trusts. Connor thought he was marrying into endless generational wealth. He called her a spoiled, delusional princess and admitted he was just playing the part of a successful rich man to secure a piece of the pie. He was nothing but a desperate gold digger who had accidentally married into a family that was just as broke and fraudulent as he was. The sheer level of absolute betrayal bouncing between the three of them was staggering to witness. Valerie was screaming at David while Brielle was hysterically crying and hitting Connor. Maxine and I sat perfectly still behind the heavy mahogany desk, simply watching the toxic empire they had built completely consume itself. They had spent 20 years making me feel completely worthless and isolated, but they had actually been lying to each other the entire time. Suddenly, David broke away from the screaming match. He stumbled forward, falling heavily onto his knees right in front of the desk. The man who had ignored me my entire life looked up at me with tears streaming down his face. He clasped his hands together, begging me for mercy. He told me that if the bank foreclosed tomorrow, the federal investigators would immediately discover the forged signatures on the loan documents. He sobbed uncontrollably, telling me he was going to spend the rest of his life in a federal penitentiary if the massive debt was not cleared immediately. David pleaded with me to use my lottery winnings to pay off the bank. He promised he would pay me back every single cent. He told me I had to save him because he was my family. He looked deep into my eyes and played the ultimate manipulation card. He choked on his tears and reminded me that he was my father. He begged me to show him the compassion that a daughter owes to the man who gave her life. I looked down at the pathetic weeping man kneeling on the carpet. I felt absolutely nothing for him. There was no anger left in my heart, just a cold, clinical detachment. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the desk, and looked directly into his desperate eyes. I told him he lost the right to call himself my father a very long time ago. I kept my voice perfectly steady and told him he completely stopped being my father the moment he stood silently by and let another man hand me an eviction notice in my own home. I reminded him that he was fully prepared to let Connor throw me out into the street with absolutely nothing while they stole the only legacy my dead mother left behind. David let out a hollow, wailing sound and buried his face in his hands, realizing that his emotional manipulation was completely useless. He knew I was not going to give him a single dime to save him from federal prison. From the corner of the room, Connor let out another dark, malicious chuckle. He pushed himself off the wall and walked slowly toward the center of the room, stepping right over the weeping body of his father-in-law. The arrogant broker wiped a spot of dirt from his tailored suit jacket and looked at me with a sickening sneer of triumph. He might be going to federal prison, but he was determined to drag me down with him. Connor looked right into my eyes and told me none of this actually mattered anyway. He pointed out that the bank was legally seizing the property tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. He reminded me that the massive debt was attached directly to the Florida estate, and the foreclosure process was completely irreversible at this late stage. Connor smiled widely and told me that even though they were broke and going to jail, I was still going to lose the precious home my mother built for me. He told me the legacy I cared so much about was completely gone. He laughed maliciously, telling me that we all lose in the end and I get absolutely nothing. I stared at his smug face and felt a deep, hollow silence settle over the room. Connor truly believed he had won. He genuinely thought his chaotic trail of financial destruction had left me completely paralyzed and cornered. He expected me to fall to the floor and sob alongside my biological father, begging for some kind of miracle. Instead, I simply stood up from my chair and calmly adjusted my tailored blazer. I looked directly at Maxine, who was already opening a new blank document on her computer monitor, completely unfazed by the pathetic temper tantrum unfolding in front of us. I turned back to the miserable group of criminals standing in our office. I told them they needed to leave the premises immediately before I called the building security and had them forcibly removed for trespassing. Connor scoffed heavily and grabbed Brielle by the arm, dragging his hysterical wife out into the hallway. Valerie grabbed David by the collar of his expensive shirt and pulled him up from the carpet, hissing vicious insults at him as they practically ran out the heavy mahogany door. The door clicked shut behind them, leaving the conference room in perfect, absolute silence. We did not have a single second to waste on their dramatic exit. The bank foreclosure was scheduled for exactly 9 in the morning, which gave Maxine and me less than 18 hours to execute the most aggressive financial maneuver of my entire career. I sat back down at the desk and pulled my laptop out of my tote bag, quickly connecting it to the secure network. Connor had boldly claimed that the $500,000 he stole from my father was already gone, swallowed up by his aggressive private lenders and failing commercial real estate ventures. But I knew exactly how arrogant men like Connor operated behind closed doors. He was far too greedy and far too selfish to simply hand over $500,000 to his creditors when his business was already doomed to fail. I opened my specialized forensic accounting software and began tearing into the digital footprint of his commercial brokerage firm. I spent the next 4 hours entirely consumed by the glowing screen, meticulously tracing every single digital transaction routing number and hidden wire transfer that moved through his corporate accounts over the past 6 weeks. It was a massive, chaotic mess of fabricated invoices and fake vendor payments specifically designed to confuse amateur auditors. But it was nothing I had not seen 100 times before in my line of work. I patiently followed the digital breadcrumbs through 3 different dummy corporations registered in Delaware and Nevada. My eyes scanned the endless scrolling data until I found the exact anomaly I was looking for. Connor had not paid his desperate lenders a single dime of that money. Instead, he had carefully funneled $480,000 through a massive labyrinth of shell companies, finally parking the stolen cash in a completely anonymous offshore account located in the Cayman Islands. He was fully planning to let his brokerage fail, let his wife go completely bankrupt, and let my father go to federal prison while he secretly hoarded the stolen equity from my mother's house to start a brand new wealthy life somewhere else. Maxine leaned over my shoulder and stared at the offshore routing numbers glowing brightly on my screen. She let out a low whistle acknowledging the absolute sheer audacity of his financial crime. But finding the stolen money was only the first half of our grand strategy. I did not want to simply call the police and report the fraud right now. If I did that, the property would be tied up in massive federal litigation for years, and the bank would still proceed with the foreclosure auction tomorrow morning to recoup their immediate losses. I needed to protect the historic estate my mother built, and I needed to do it before the sun came up over the city. I told Maxine to contact the regional director of the commercial bank that held the fraudulent mortgage. We needed to completely bypass the standard legal channels and go straight to the executive board. Because I had just won the massive lottery jackpot, I had tens of millions of dollars sitting safely in a highly secure corporate holding company. I was absolutely not going to use that money to simply pay off the stolen debt and magically clear my father's name. That would let them all off the hook entirely and erase the leverage I currently held. Instead, I instructed Maxine to use my private corporate holding company to make a direct aggressive offer to the banking executives. We spent the entire night negotiating with the bank executives over encrypted video calls. The regional director was completely panicked when Maxine calmly informed him that his careless loan officers had approved a $500,000 mortgage based on blatantly forged signatures and fraudulent title documents. She casually mentioned that the bank was about to be named as a primary defendant in a massive federal lawsuit for failing to perform basic due diligence on a historic property trust. The wealthy executives knew they were staring down the barrel of a massive public relations nightmare and millions of dollars in devastating legal fees. They were incredibly desperate to completely wash their hands of the toxic fraudulent loan before the financial markets opened in the morning. That was exactly when Maxine presented our perfect solution. She formally offered that my private corporate entity would purchase the distressed debt outright in pure cash. We would buy the fraudulent mortgage directly from the bank for the full principal amount, plus all accumulated interest and late fees. The bank would recover all their lost money immediately without a messy public scandal, and my holding company would assume total legal ownership of the loan. The executives were so incredibly relieved to avoid a federal investigation that they enthusiastically approved the private sale in less than 2 hours. By the time the sun began to rise over the quiet city skyline, the massive wire transfer had successfully cleared the Federal Reserve. Maxine printed the final digital contracts and laid them out on the smooth desk in front of me. I picked up my favorite heavy metal pen and signed my name on the bottom line, feeling a deep, overwhelming sense of absolute power flow through my veins. The complex strategy had worked flawlessly. I walked over to the tall floor-to-ceiling window and looked down at the empty city streets below the law office. Connor and Valerie were probably sitting in their luxurious rented house right now, confidently believing that they had completely destroyed my life. They genuinely thought I was spending the early morning packing my bags and crying over the tragic loss of my childhood home. They thought the bank was coming to seize the beautiful property and throw me out onto the cold street. But they had absolutely no idea what I had just accomplished in the dark of the night. I turned back to look at the thick stack of official legal documents resting on the mahogany desk. I was no longer just the helpless victim of a forged quitclaim deed and a massive financial betrayal. I was no longer the poor, unwanted stepdaughter fighting to keep a roof over her head against greedy relatives. By executing the private corporate buyout, I had fundamentally shifted the entire balance of power in a way they could never possibly anticipate. I did not just save the house from the brutal foreclosure auction today. I had actually purchased the fraudulent note entirely for myself. That meant I was now the sole and absolute lien holder on the $500,000 debt. I was the bank. I owned the mortgage, and now I completely owned them. 2 days had passed since I completely flipped the chessboard and bought the fraudulent debt. Valerie, being completely unaware that I was now the sole owner of the massive mortgage, decided to play her ultimate victim card. I sat in the back of my tinted luxury sedan, parked just down the street from the Florida estate, watching the spectacle unfold. Valerie had hastily organized a massive charity gala right on the manicured front lawn. She called it a Save the Estate fundraiser. Huge white tents were set up near the rose gardens, and a local string quartet was playing soft classical music near the entrance. Through the open gates, I could see Valerie circulating among the wealthiest socialites in the neighborhood. She was pouring them expensive champagne that she absolutely could not afford and feeding them the most disgusting lies imaginable. I had a private investigator listening in the crowd, and he texted me real-time updates. Valerie was telling everyone that I had suffered a severe mental breakdown after my sudden stroke of financial luck. She was actively weeping and wiping away fake tears, claiming that my supposed mental illness had caused me to abandon my responsibilities and let the historic family home fall into foreclosure. She begged her rich friends for immediate cash donations, claiming she needed a massive legal defense fund to save the property from being seized by the ruthless banks tomorrow morning. She was preying on their sympathy, collecting massive checks and promising that every single dollar would go toward fighting the evil forces trying to ruin her pristine life. It was a completely brilliant scam, designed to line her own empty pockets right before the eviction. I stepped out of the luxury sedan, and the warm evening breeze caught the heavy silk of my dress. I wore a custom emerald green designer gown that swept the pavement, perfectly tailored to project absolute power and unbothered grace. I walked slowly up the long paved driveway, listening to the clinking glasses and the polite chatter of the neighborhood elite. As I got closer to the main tent, my eyes locked directly onto Valerie. She was standing near the entrance, greeting a local politician, but it was not her fake smile that caught my attention. It was the glittering stones hanging from her ears. The sparkling jewels caught the light from the chandeliers strung up inside the tent. The air left my lungs for a fraction of a second. Valerie was actually wearing the vintage diamond drop earrings that had belonged to my late mother. Those earrings were the last physical gift my biological father had given my mother before she passed away, and they were supposed to be locked inside the secure master bedroom safe. Seeing them dangling from the ears of the woman who had terrorized me my entire life was the ultimate act of disrespect. It was literal theft. Valerie was not just trying to steal my home and my money, she was actively parading around wearing the sacred heirlooms of my dead mother while using her house to run a fraudulent charity scam. I squared my shoulders and marched directly toward the entrance of the main tent. The polite chatter of the wealthy guests began to immediately die down as they noticed me approaching. People turned their heads and whispered behind their champagne flutes, recognizing me from the terrible smear campaign videos Brielle had posted online earlier that week. The string quartet slowly stopped playing as the heavy, awkward silence spread across the manicured lawn. Valerie suddenly turned around, and the fake smile completely vanished from her face the second she saw me standing there in my stunning designer gown. "You do not belong here," Valerie hissed, rushing forward to physically block my path at the edge of the white tent. She frantically signaled to a pair of large private security guards she had hired for the evening. They quickly stepped up behind her, crossing their thick arms and trying to look intimidating. "You have some incredible nerve showing your face here after what you did to this family," Valerie announced loudly, making sure all the wealthy country club wives could hear her. "This is a private charity event to save the home you selfishly destroyed. You are mentally unwell, Iman, and you need to leave right now before I have you arrested for trespassing." I stopped walking and stood perfectly still, just inches away from her face. I looked directly at the diamond earrings glittering in the soft tent lighting. "You are running a fraudulent charity scam on the front lawn of a house you do not own," I said, my voice carrying clearly over the dead silence of the crowd. "And you are wearing stolen jewelry that belongs to my dead mother." I kept my posture absolutely rigid, refusing to show any signs of intimidation, while her hired thugs loomed over me. The wealthy guests gasped loudly at the accusation. Several women physically took a step backward, pulling their expensive purses closer to their chests. Valerie turned a bright shade of red, her hands shaking as she tried to maintain her carefully constructed victim narrative. "She is completely delusional," Valerie shouted to the crowd, gesturing wildly at me. "This is exactly the mental breakdown I was telling you all about. She has lost her mind and is making up insane lies because she is ashamed of her own massive failures." She turned back to the security guards with wild, desperate eyes. "Remove her from my property right this second, grab her arms and physically throw her out into the street." The two large guards took a heavy step forward, reaching out to grab the silk fabric of my dress. They wanted to humiliate me by physically dragging me down the long driveway while all those rich socialites watched in silence. I did not flinch, and I absolutely did not try to force my way inside the tent. I simply took one calm step backward, smoothing the front of my emerald gown. I looked at Valerie with a cold, dead expression. "You keep calling this your property," I said loudly. "But the truth is that you and David defaulted on a fraudulent $500,000 mortgage, and the bank is taking complete possession of this estate. And the best part is that I am the bank." Valerie looked completely confused, her brow furrowing as her tiny brain tried to process the words I just said. Before she could open her mouth to argue, I simply raised my right hand into the air and signaled toward the dark street. The heavy silence of the evening was instantly shattered by the deafening wail of police sirens. 3 fully marked county sheriff vehicles suddenly turned off the main road and accelerated aggressively up the long paved driveway. Their bright red and blue emergency lights flashed wildly, reflecting off the white tents and the terrified faces of the wealthy guests. The heavy tires crunched over the gravel as the vehicles skidded to a sudden halt right behind me, blocking the entire entrance to the gala. Valerie stumbled backward, clutching her chest, as 4 uniformed sheriff deputies stepped out of their vehicles with their hands resting on their duty belts, walking directly toward the woman wearing my mother's stolen diamonds. The heavy boots of the 4 sheriff deputies crunched loudly against the gravel driveway. The rhythmic flash of red and blue emergency lights washed over the manicured lawn, casting long, eerie shadows across the massive white tents and the terrified faces of the wealthy gala guests. Valerie was completely frozen in place, her hand hovering nervously near her throat, where my mother's stolen diamonds rested. The confident socialite, who had just been loudly demanding my arrest, was now physically trembling as law enforcement officers marched directly toward her. Connor immediately snapped out of his temporary shock and went straight into his usual arrogant mode. He puffed out his chest, straightening the lapels of his expensive tailored suit jacket, and marched forward to intercept the deputies. He completely bypassed me, positioning his body to shield Valerie as if he were the heroic lord of the manor defending his castle from a petty disturbance. He plastered on that familiar, condescending smile he always reserved for people he considered the help. "Officers, there seems to be a massive misunderstanding," Connor announced, his voice dripping with wealthy entitlement and false authority. "This woman is trespassing on my family's private property. She is having a severe mental episode, and she is harassing our charity guests. I need you to remove her from the premises immediately before she becomes violent." Watching him confidently try to weaponize law enforcement against me made the blood boil in my veins. It was a vicious, familiar tactic. I vividly remembered the summer I turned 18 when I invited a small group of my black friends over for a backyard barbecue to celebrate our graduation. Connor had just started dating Brielle and was staying at the house for the weekend. He had quietly called the local police and reported a group of suspicious individuals loitering on the private estate, completely ignoring the fact that they were my invited guests. I remembered how he had stood on the second-floor balcony with that exact same smug smile sipping a beer while he watched the officers interrogate my friends on the lawn. He had absolutely relished the power he held to make people of color feel unsafe and unwelcome in our predominantly white neighborhood. He was trying to play the exact same disgusting card right now, assuming his expensive suit and arrogant tone would automatically grant him unquestioned authority over me. But the lead deputy did not even break his stride. He completely ignored Connor's outstretched hand and stepped right past him, treating the supposedly successful commercial broker like an invisible piece of furniture. Connor stood there with his hand hanging awkwardly in the air, his arrogant facade cracking as the officers bypassed him entirely. The lead deputy walked directly up to Valerie. She was trembling so violently now that the diamond earrings were visibly shaking against her neck, catching the red and blue flashes of the police lights. "Valerie Sterling," the deputy asked, his voice booming over the quiet, frightened murmurs of the stunned crowd. Valerie could not even form a coherent word. Her mouth opened and closed silently, and she offered a tiny, terrified nod. The deputy pulled a thick, sealed legal envelope from his heavy clipboard and held it out to her. "I am serving you with a formal notice of foreclosure and a writ of immediate eviction," he stated loudly, ensuring that every single wealthy socialite in the front row heard him perfectly clearly. "The property has been legally seized by the lien holder, and the current occupants are ordered by the county court to vacate the premises tonight." Valerie let out a strangled, high-pitched gasp and took a clumsy step backward, refusing to take the heavy envelope as if the paper itself was going to burn her hands. The wealthy guests standing around her gasped collectively. The women who had just written massive checks to Valerie's fake legal defense fund were now whispering furiously to each other, pulling out their phones, and realizing they had been completely scammed by a woman who was actively being thrown out of her own house for failing to pay her bills. Connor snatched the thick envelope from the deputy's hand, his face twisting with absolute panic. He ripped open the official seal and frantically scanned the legal documents, his eyes darting wildly across the pages. The confident smirk was completely gone, replaced by sheer raw terror. His face drained of all color, turning a sickly shade of gray as he read the undeniable court orders. "This is impossible!" Connor shouted, waving the papers aggressively in the air. He turned his desperate, frantic eyes toward the deputies, losing all of his previous composure. "We spoke to the regional director of the bank just yesterday. They explicitly guaranteed us a standard 30-day grace period to clear the arrears and secure a new bridge loan. You cannot legally evict us tonight. The bank said we had 30 days. That was my exact cue. I stepped forward, the heavy silk of my emerald gown brushing against the cool evening grass. I held my own sleek leather folder securely in my hands. The crowd of socialites parted slightly, giving me the floor as they watched the drama unfold with wide eyes. I looked Connor directly in the eye, watching the sheer panic set in as he realized he had completely lost control of the narrative, and his entire fraudulent life was collapsing around him. "The bank did say you had 30 days, I said, my voice carrying a quiet, lethal authority that cut right through his desperate shouting. "But that was before they sold your distressed debt, Connor." I opened my folder and pulled out the finalized, legally binding transfer documents, holding them up in the flashing police lights for him to see. "They sold your fraudulent mortgage. To me." I took one deliberate step closer, invading his space and forcing him to look at the undeniable paperwork that proved my absolute, total victory. I kept my gaze locked onto his terrified, sweating face, refusing to let him look away from the woman he had tried to destroy. "I am the bank now," I told him, my voice echoing across the silent lawn. "And you have exactly 1 hour to vacate my property." The collective gasp from the high society guests ripped through the warm night air like a physical shockwave. The absolute magnitude of my declaration hung over the manicured lawn, freezing everyone perfectly in place. Valerie stood completely paralyzed. The heavy legal envelope containing the immediate eviction notice slipped from her trembling fingers and hit the grass with a soft, dull thud. Her carefully constructed empire of lies was vaporizing in real time, right in front of the exact people she had spent her entire life trying to impress. The wealthy socialites who had just written massive checks to her fake legal defense fund suddenly broke the heavy silence. The polite whispers turned into furious, angry demands. Women in designer gowns began shouting at Valerie, calling her a fraud and demanding their charity donations back immediately. Valerie's flawless social standing, the only thing she truly cared about in this miserable world, was entirely eradicated in a matter of seconds. Connor could not process the absolute destruction of his grand master plan. The arrogant smirk that usually lived on his face was immediately replaced by a twisted mask of pure, unadulterated rage. His face turned a deep mottled shade of purple, and the thick veins in his neck bulged against his expensive silk collar. The realization that I, an unwanted stepdaughter he viewed as completely beneath him, had systematically outsmarted and cornered him, broke his fragile ego into a million pieces. He let out a guttural scream of absolute fury and lunged violently across the grass directly toward me. His hands curled into tight fists as he charged forward, fully intending to physically attack me right there in front of the entire country club neighborhood. Before Connor could even close the distance, Maxine moved with terrifying speed and precision. She stepped squarely in front of me, perfectly shielding my body with her own. She did not flinch or back away from his aggressive advance for a single second. Instead, she looked him dead in the eye with absolute legal authority. She raised her voice, projecting it clearly across the chaos of the lawn. She firmly reminded Connor that physically assaulting the legal lien holder of the property while standing directly in front of 4 armed county sheriff deputies would instantly earn him a one-way ticket to a federal penitentiary. The deputies immediately rested their hands on their duty weapons, stepping forward in unison to intercept his charge. Connor froze instantly, his heavy breathing echoing in the tense silence. He realized he was inches away from being tackled to the dirt and handcuffed on the front lawn. His chest heaved up and down as he stared at Maxine with pure hatred, but he did not dare take another step forward. He swallowed hard, trying to regain some shred of his shattered dignity, while the armed officers watched his every single move. I stepped smoothly around Maxine, closing the final few inches between Connor and myself. I looked up into his panicked, sweating face and smiled a cold, deeply satisfying smile. I told him our business transaction was not quite finished yet. I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out a second sleek black folder. I held it out to him, but his hands were shaking too badly to take it. So I simply opened it myself and held the crisp financial documents up to the flashing red and blue police lights so he could read the bold print. I kept my voice perfectly level, making sure every single person in the crowd could hear the final nail being hammered into his coffin. I told Connor that while I was tracing the $500,000 he stole from my biological father, I noticed a massive vulnerability in his corporate structure. I explained that I had used my private corporate holding company to completely buy up the distressed commercial debt on his failing real estate brokerage. I watched the blood completely drain from his face as the reality of my words crushed the remaining breath out of his lungs. I told him that I was now the primary creditor for his entire business operation, and I was officially calling in the massive debt immediately. I stared right into his terrified eyes and told him he was officially bankrupt. Connor opened his mouth to speak, but only a pathetic wheezing sound came out. His eyes darted around wildly, searching the crowd for any possible escape route from the financial slaughter. But I refused to give him a single second to recover his bearings. I leaned in slightly closer, lowering my voice just enough to make the final blow feel incredibly intimate and entirely devastating. I casually mentioned that during my forensic accounting investigation, I had stumbled upon his secret offshore shell company hidden away in the Cayman Islands. I watched his eyes widen in sheer, unadulterated terror. He knew exactly what that meant. I smiled sweetly and told him that I had already forwarded the entire digital paper trail, including the routing numbers and the fabricated vendor invoices, directly to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. I informed him that the federal agents were highly interested in his aggressive tax evasion and his blatant corporate fraud. I told him he was not just losing his brokerage and his stolen money, he was going to lose his absolute freedom. The heavy silence that followed my financial takedown was suddenly shattered by the sharp sound of expensive heels stomping across the paved driveway. Brielle marched forward, pushing her way past the stunned socialites and the watchful sheriff deputies. Her face was a mask of pure aristocratic fury. She had heard every single word I said. Brielle had married Connor strictly because he promised her a life of endless luxury and elite social status. She had tied her entire identity to his fake success. Now she was staring at a man who was utterly broke, buried in massive corporate debt, and facing serious federal prison time for tax fraud. She stopped right in front of Connor. He looked at his wife with pathetic, pleading eyes, begging her silently for some kind of support or defense. Brielle did not say a single word to comfort him. She simply raised her hand and delivered a vicious, echoing slap directly across Connor's face. The sharp, cracking sound rang out over the manicured lawn, making several wealthy guests gasp in pure shock. Connor's head snapped to the side, leaving a bright red handprint blooming across his pale cheek. He stood there completely humiliated, publicly bankrupted, and entirely destroyed in front of the exact high society crowd he had spent his entire life trying to impress. The sharp crack of the slap echoed across the manicured lawn, hanging heavily in the humid evening air. For a split second, nobody moved. The wealthy guests stood completely paralyzed, watching as Connor touched his bright red cheek in absolute shock. But the sheriff deputies did not care about high society drama or domestic squabbles. The lead deputy immediately stepped forward, placing his hand firmly on his duty belt and shutting down the entire spectacle. He looked directly at Valerie and Connor, and his voice boomed with absolute, undeniable authority. He told them that the foreclosure order was active and fully enforceable. He stated that they had exactly 1 hour to gather their immediate personal belongings and vacate the premises, or they would be escorted off the private property in handcuffs. I did not even give them a single second to process the terrifying reality of his words. I simply raised my right hand and gestured toward the bottom of the long paved driveway where a large, unmarked box truck had been quietly idling in the shadows for the last 20 minutes. The heavy back doors rolled up with a loud metallic rattle, and a crew of 6 professional movers marched straight onto the grass. They were not carrying delicate cardboard moving boxes or expensive protective bubble wrap. They were carrying thick, heavy-duty rolls of black plastic garbage bags. It was the exact same brand of industrial trash bags that Connor and Valerie had forced me to use when they callously threw my entire life out onto the street just a few short weeks ago. I pointed directly at the massive front doors of the estate and instructed the moving crew to head straight up to the master suite and the guest bedrooms. I told them they had exactly 60 minutes to clear out every single piece of designer clothing, every pair of shoes, and every luxury accessory belonging to the former occupants. Valerie let out a blood-curdling shriek as the large men marched right past her and entered the house. She stumbled frantically after them, her expensive heels sinking deep into the soft grass, screaming hysterically about her irreplaceable custom wardrobe. I followed her inside, flanked closely by 2 of the armed deputies, just in time to witness the absolute poetic justice unfolding in the grand foyer. The movers were incredibly efficient. They scooped up armfuls of Valerie's prized collection of designer handbags and ruthlessly shoved them deep into the black plastic sacks. Valerie fell heavily to her knees on the polished hardwood floor, sobbing uncontrollably, as a mover blindly tossed 3 pairs of her favorite red-bottom stilettos into a garbage bag and carelessly tied it shut with a harsh plastic snap. She begged them to stop weeping, that the expensive leather would be completely ruined, and the bags would permanently lose their shape. She looked up at me with dark mascara running in thick rivers down her pale face, completely stripped of her arrogant, aristocratic pride. She demanded to know how I could possibly be so cruel and heartless to treat her precious belongings like common everyday trash. I looked down at her miserable, pathetic face and calmly reminded her that this was exactly how she had treated my mother's sacred belongings. I kept my voice perfectly steady and told her that trash belongs in trash bags. But I was not quite finished with her yet. I crouched down so I was perfectly level with her tear-stained face. I stared directly at the vintage diamond drop earrings that were still catching the light from the crystal chandelier above us. I held out my hand palm up and told her to take off my mother's jewelry right this exact second. Valerie instinctively covered her ears, shaking her head and whimpering that David had personally gifted those diamonds to her for their anniversary. One of the sheriff deputies immediately stepped forward, towering over her kneeling form. He politely but firmly reminded her that possession of stolen property is a serious felony offense, and he would be more than happy to add theft charges to her miserable evening. Trembling with fresh, terrified tears, Valerie slowly reached up and unclasped the heavy diamonds. She dropped them into my waiting palm. The cool, precious metal touched my skin, and a profound sense of absolute peace washed over me. I had finally reclaimed the ultimate symbol of my mother's legacy. As I stood up and carefully secured the earrings inside my silk designer clutch, a pathetic shuffling noise caught my attention from the hallway. David had literally crawled into the foyer. He looked completely destroyed. His expensive tailored suit was hopelessly wrinkled. His face was red and bloated from crying, and he looked 20 years older than he had just an hour ago. He dragged himself across the smooth floor and physically grabbed the hem of my emerald green gown. He looked up at me with the most desperate, pathetic eyes I had ever seen. He started apologizing profusely, his voice cracking and wheezing as he sobbed. He blamed absolutely everything on Valerie and Connor. He claimed he was just a weak old man who had been completely manipulated and bullied by his greedy wife and her terrifying son-in-law. He swore to me that he never wanted to hurt me and that he had loved my mother more than anything else in the entire world. He begged me to remember the good times we had when I was a little girl long before Valerie moved in and poisoned his mind against me. He pleaded for a second chance, begging me to let him stay in the house just in the tiny guest room so he would not have to sleep on the cold, unforgiving street. He told me he was entirely bankrupt and had absolutely nowhere else to go. I looked down at the sniveling man who had contributed half of my DNA and felt absolutely no pity for his crocodile tears. I calmly pulled the silk fabric of my dress away from his grasping, sweaty hands and took a deliberate step back. I looked down at him and prepared to deliver the absolute final crushing blow of the entire evening. I kept my voice loud enough for Valerie and Connor to hear perfectly from the other room. I told David that he was absolutely right about one thing. He was incredibly weak, but I told him his pathetic weakness had just cost him the biggest miracle of his entire miserable life. I looked directly into his tear-filled eyes and told him the absolute undeniable truth. I told him that on the exact day he let Connor and Valerie throw me out of this beautiful house like garbage, I had a small piece of paper folded up in my pocket. I explained that I had just walked out of the state lottery office holding a winning ticket worth exactly $32 million. I watched his eyes go perfectly wide, his jaw dropping open as the astronomical number echoed through the quiet hallway. I told him I had rushed home that afternoon, fully intending to forgive all of his past mistakes. I had planned to look him in the eye and give him half of the massive jackpot to completely clear his debts and let him live comfortably for the rest of his life. But instead of protecting his own daughter, he stood silently in the corner and let another man hand me a trash bag. I leaned down close to his ear and told him to enjoy the bed he made because he would be sleeping in it for the rest of his miserable bankrupt life. The sheriff deputies gave the final order, and the physical reality of the eviction completely set in. David remained slumped on the floor for another long minute before he slowly dragged himself upright, leaning heavily against the grand staircase like a broken man. He did not say another word to me. He simply turned and stumbled out the massive front doors, joining the rest of his ruined family. The professional movers worked with ruthless efficiency, streaming past him, carrying the heavy, black industrial garbage bags that held the entirety of their glamorous lives. The luxurious charity gala had completely vanished. The wealthy socialites had scrambled into their luxury vehicles and fled the scene the very second they realized they were attending an active police eviction. The expensive caterers had packed up their silver chafing dishes and sprinted away. The string quartet was long gone. The manicured front lawn was completely empty save for the crushed grass where the white tents had stood just an hour ago. I walked slowly down the front steps and watched the final act of their absolute destruction unfold at the edge of the property line. Valerie, David, Brielle, and Connor were standing on the concrete curb illuminated only by the harsh yellow glow of a single street lamp. They were surrounded by dozens of cheap black plastic garbage bags. The crisp night wind picked up, and Valerie shivered violently, pulling her thin designer shawl tightly across her shoulders. She was weeping silently into her hands, her perfect makeup completely destroyed. Connor was furiously tapping the cracked screen of his smartphone. His expensive sports cars had been legally locked behind the estate gates as part of the corporate asset seizure. He was aggressively refreshing the screen, trying to order a budget rideshare to pick them up from the sidewalk. It was a perfectly poetic mirror image of the exact moment they had thrown me out into the cold, demanding I call an Uber and take my trash bags with me. Now they were the ones standing on the curb waiting for a stranger to haul them away to a cheap motel. I turned my back on the pathetic scene playing out under the street lamp and walked back up the stone steps. The sheriff deputies nodded respectfully to me as they finished their final perimeter check and headed back to their patrol vehicles. I stepped inside the grand foyer, and the heavy oak doors shut behind me, muting the sound of the crickets and the distant traffic. The house was completely empty now. The movers had stripped away every single piece of furniture, every expensive Persian rug, and every gaudy painting Valerie had ever hung on the walls. The massive rooms echoed with my slow footsteps as I walked through the vacant halls. I stepped into the formal dining room where the long mahogany table used to sit. I vividly remembered the countless evenings Valerie had forced me to eat my dinner alone in the kitchen long after the rest of the family had finished their lavish meals. I walked out into the grand hallway and looked up at the sweeping curved staircase. I could almost see Brielle standing near the top landing, laughing cruelly, as she purposely tripped me and sent my schoolbooks flying down the wooden steps. I moved slowly through the empty living room, where David used to sit in his leather armchair, completely ignoring my existence while he showered Brielle with praise and expensive gifts. The sheer physical space of the massive estate should have felt victorious. I had successfully reclaimed the property and utterly destroyed the people who stole it from my mother. But as I stood alone in the center of the vacant house, the lingering trauma hung heavily in the air like thick, suffocating smoke. I realized in that quiet moment that simply possessing the title to the real estate did not magically scrub away the decades of severe emotional abuse I had endured within these walls. The polished wood floors still echoed with my mother's quiet tears and my own childhood fears. The dark corners of the house still held the memories of every cruel insult, every malicious lie, and every deliberate act of isolation. I took a deep breath of the stale indoor air and felt a sudden profound sense of clarity. I did not want this house. I had never wanted this house. I only wanted to take it away from them, so they could never again use it to project their fraudulent superiority onto the world. This building was a monument to their greed, and I had absolutely no desire to live inside a museum of my own childhood misery. I turned around and walked back out the front doors. The cool night air hit my face, feeling incredibly refreshing after the stifling atmosphere of the empty halls. Down at the curb, the budget rideshare had still not arrived. Brielle spotted me standing alone on the massive front porch, looking down at them from the top of the stone steps. Her absolute fury finally boiled over, completely consuming whatever remaining shred of dignity she had left. She stepped away from Connor and marched a few feet up the paved driveway, stopping right at the edge of the property line. She pointed a trembling finger at me and screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice cracking with pure bitter jealousy. She shouted that I was nothing but a lonely, bitter woman who had destroyed her own family out of pure spite. She screamed that I was going to rot inside this massive, empty mansion, all by myself with no family to keep me company and absolutely nobody to love me. She wanted to hurt me one last time, desperately trying to convince herself that she was somehow still socially superior, even while standing next to actual garbage bags waiting for a cheap taxi. I did not raise my voice or react to her childish screaming tantrum. I simply reached into my silk designer clutch and pulled out the heavy brass key. I inserted it into the lock of the massive double doors and turned it, feeling the deeply satisfying heavy click of the deadbolt sliding firmly into place. I pulled the key out and turned back around, looking down the long, dark driveway at my furious sister. I smiled a genuine, relaxed smile for the first time all evening. Who said I'm gonna live here? A week had passed since I locked the heavy oak doors of the estate and left my completely ruined family standing on the curb surrounded by cheap industrial garbage bags. The brutal reality of their newly destitute life had set in with terrifying and absolute speed. Valerie and David were now living in a cramped, dingy motel on the absolute outskirts of the city. I had a private investigator keeping strict tabs on them just to ensure they did not try to pull any last-minute desperate stunts or attempt to flee the jurisdiction. The detailed reports and photographs I received were incredibly satisfying to review over my morning coffee. The motel room they rented by the week smelled like stale cigarette smoke and cheap industrial bleach, which was a far cry from the imported lavender candles and fresh orchids Valerie used to demand in her grand foyer. There was no room service, no private chef, and absolutely no wealthy socialites dropping by for afternoon tea. They were forced to eat greasy fast food out of styrofoam containers while sitting on a sagging mattress under a flickering neon sign that buzzed loudly outside their single-stained window. Connor was faring considerably worse than my completely humiliated parents. The federal agents from the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation had not wasted a single second after I handed over the highly detailed digital paper trail of his offshore shell companies. He was formally indicted on multiple federal charges, including wire fraud, tax evasion, and aggressive corporate embezzlement. His passport was immediately confiscated by authorities, and his remaining personal and business assets were completely frozen by a federal judge pending a lengthy criminal trial. Brielle, true to her completely shallow and materialistic nature, did not stick around to support her husband during his darkest and most terrifying hour. The absolute second she realized the luxury sports cars, the designer clothes, and the exclusive country club memberships were gone forever, she filed for expedited divorce. She moved into a small, cramped apartment with a reluctant friend and completely cut off all contact with Connor, proving once and for all that her entire marriage was nothing more than a failed financial transaction. She spent her days crying on social media, trying to play the victim, but her followers quickly turned on her once the truth about her fraudulent lifestyle came to light. Valerie, however, simply could not accept that her reign as the neighborhood queen was permanently over. She was completely addicted to public sympathy, and she arrogantly assumed she could just spin her way out of this disaster like she always did. Sitting in her squalid motel room, she frantically dialed the producers at the local news station. She pitched them a heartbreaking story about a cruel, vindictive stepdaughter who had illegally stolen her historic family home and cast an elderly couple out into the unforgiving streets. She fully expected the camera crews to rush to her motel door so she could weep on national television, dab at her dry eyes, and launch a brand new fraudulent fundraising campaign to steal more money from unsuspecting viewers. But she severely underestimated how thoroughly and systematically I had dismantled her entire public image. The local media outlets had already accessed the unsealed county court records. The investigative reporters had seen the irrefutable hard evidence of her fraudulent second mortgage, her charity gala scam, and the official police eviction reports. Instead of sending a sympathetic camera crew to interview her, the news station ran a devastating investigative segment during the prime evening broadcast. They completely exposed her fake Save the Estate charity, displaying the forged financial documents and the bad checks right on the screen for the entire city to see. Valerie was officially and permanently disgraced. She was permanently banned from the country club, blacklisted from every elite charity board, and turned into a massive laughingstock among the high society she had worshipped her entire life. She could not even walk into a local grocery store without people whispering, pointing, and laughing at the woman who tried to steal from her own family and ended up with absolutely nothing. While Valerie was sitting in her motel room watching her fake aristocratic legacy burn to the ground on the evening news, I was standing on the manicured front lawn of the property. The early morning sun was just beginning to burn through the thick rolling fog, casting a warm golden light over the massive brick facade of the estate. But the quiet, peaceful silence of the wealthy neighborhood was about to be completely shattered. A deep rumbling vibration shook the ground beneath my leather boots as a convoy of heavy construction machinery slowly turned up the long paved driveway. Two massive yellow excavators, their heavy metal treads chewing up the expensive imported gravel, rolled aggressively onto the pristine front lawn, followed closely by a fleet of industrial dump trucks and a professional demolition crew. Maxine stood right beside me holding a metal clipboard containing the fully approved city demolition permits. She watched as the heavy machinery maneuvered into position, tearing deep, muddy tracks through Valerie's prized, award-winning rose gardens. The loud mechanical roar of the heavy diesel engines completely drowned out the polite morning silence of the estate. Maxine turned to look at me, her expression a mixture of professional awe and deep personal understanding. She stepped closer so I could hear her over the deafening noise and asked me quietly if I was absolutely sure I wanted to go through with this. I did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. I gave her a firm, definitive nod, keeping my eyes locked on the massive structure that had housed so much of my childhood misery. I told her to give the signal to the foreman. The lead operator immediately pulled his levers and raised the massive articulated steel arm of the excavator, swinging it backward before driving the heavy metal bucket directly into the second-floor walls. The historic bricks and mortar exploded outward in a massive violent cloud of gray dust and shattered glass. The steel teeth tore ruthlessly through the expensive crown molding and the imported silk wallpaper, completely obliterating the master bedroom that had once been Valerie's untouchable private sanctuary. I stood there breathing in the dust and watching the walls collapse, knowing that simply owning the property was never going to be enough to erase the trauma. I was tearing the entire house down to the ground. By noon the next day, the local news channels were absolutely consumed by the aerial helicopter footage of the demolition. The wealthy suburban neighborhood was in a state of absolute shock and collective outrage. The pristine $3 million estate was completely leveled, reduced to a massive pile of shattered bricks, twisted metal, and pulverized drywall. The media outlets simply could not understand why the mysterious lottery winner, who had just purchased the historic property in a cash foreclosure sale, would immediately bring in heavy excavators to destroy such a beautiful and expensive home. They ran endless dramatic segments speculating about my mental state and my chaotic financial strategies. The news anchors debated whether I was a reckless amateur who had already lost my mind to sudden wealth. The wealthy neighbors gave frantic television interviews from their manicured lawns, expressing their absolute horror at the loud destruction disrupting their quiet, privileged lives. They complained about the dust coating their expensive luxury cars and the heavy diesel trucks ruining their perfect streets. But they had absolutely no idea about the decades of quiet suffering that had taken place inside those walls. They did not know about the tears I had shed in those hallways, or the cruel psychological warfare Valerie had waged against me while they were busy attending her fake charity galas. My phone vibrated on the cool marble countertop of my new downtown penthouse apartment. I looked at the glowing screen and saw David's name flashing urgently. He had somehow managed to keep his cell phone active despite his severe financial ruin and his impending personal bankruptcy. I answered the call and put it on speaker, setting the device down next to my steaming cup of green tea. David was weeping hysterically on the other end of the line. His voice was thick with pathetic grief and absolute desperation as he choked out the broken words. He asked me how I could possibly destroy our beautiful family home. He sobbed that he had seen the drone footage playing on the small television in his cramped, dingy motel room, and it felt like I had ripped his actual heart out of his chest. He begged me to explain why I would tear down the only place where we had ever been a real happy family. He told me he was watching the walls of his own bedroom collapse on the news, and he felt like his entire legacy was being ground into useless dirt. I listened to his miserable weeping and felt absolutely nothing but cold, hard clarity. I took a slow sip of my tea and leaned close to the microphone. I kept my voice perfectly level and calmly corrected his delusional revisionist history. I told David that the massive brick building had completely ceased being a family home on the exact day my mother took her final agonizing breath. I reminded him how he had immediately moved Valerie into my mother's sacred space, letting her ruthlessly erase every single trace of the beautiful woman who had actually loved him. I told him that the house was nothing but a physical monument to his pathetic weakness and Valerie's toxic, insatiable greed. I explained that I was not just knocking down drywall and tearing up expensive hardwood floors out of random anger. I was fundamentally purging the absolute poison from the soil itself. I told him I was cleansing the earth of their toxic legacy, so that something pure and powerful could finally grow in its place. I did not wait for his sniveling apologies or his weak attempts to justify his past failures. I simply tapped the screen and ended the call, permanently blocking his number from ever reaching me again. I walked over to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse and looked out over the sprawling city skyline. I was not just a lucky lottery winner, throwing money around out of pure spite and reckless emotion. I was a highly trained and deeply meticulous forensic accountant. I had spent my entire professional career tracking hidden assets, analyzing incredibly complex financial structures, and building airtight legal cases against fraudulent corporate executives. I knew exactly how to maximize the impact of my $32 million windfall, down to the very last penny. I spent the next several months working closely with elite urban planners, progressive commercial architects, and top-tier property developers. We completely cleared the massive pile of structural debris from the suburban lot, hauling away the physical remains of Valerie's ruined kingdom in dozens of heavy dump trucks. We excavated the foundation deep into the dark earth, pouring fresh, reinforced concrete and laying the groundwork for a massive commercial project right in the middle of the most exclusive residential neighborhood in the entire state. The wealthy neighbors formed angry neighborhood committees and tried desperately to file legal injunctions to stop the commercial zoning permits from being approved. They hired expensive lawyers to block my construction crews from entering the gated community. But my extensive forensic accounting background had taught me exactly how to navigate local government bureaucracy and exploit legal loopholes. I had already secured every single necessary permit, environmental variance, and legal authorization long before the first excavator ever rolled up the driveway. I hired the most aggressive corporate law firm in Atlanta to completely crush their pathetic neighborhood petitions in court. The construction crews worked around the clock, erecting a stunning modern facility of reinforced glass and brushed steel exactly where the oppressive brick mansion used to stand. It was a massive four-story complex featuring state-of-the-art architectural design, flooded with natural sunlight and surrounded by expansive community gardens, filled with the exact same flowers my mother used to grow. Maxine visited me at the active construction site a few months later as the final structural steel beams were being locked into place by the massive tower cranes. We stood together on the freshly paved entrance walkway, wearing white protective hard hats and looking up at the magnificent gleaming building. Maxine unrolled the massive architectural blueprint across the hood of my luxury sedan, smoothing out the heavy blue paper with her hands. She traced her finger over the incredibly detailed floor plans, showing the expansive, interactive lecture halls, the high-tech computer labs, and the collaborative workspace environments designed for maximum creative output. I pointed out the specific classrooms where industry experts would teach advanced forensic accounting, real estate investing, and aggressive stock market strategies. I wanted to arm the next generation with the exact same financial weapons I had used to completely destroy Connor and Valerie. She looked up at me with a profound sense of pride and absolute awe shining in her dark eyes. She asked me if I was finally ready to officially unveil the true purpose of the project to the waiting world. I gave her a slow, confident nod and looked back down at the bold printed lettering running across the top margin of the blueprint. The property was no longer an exclusive, isolated playground for arrogant elite socialites. It was officially designated as the Amani Center for Excellence. It was a groundbreaking state-of-the-art educational and financial literacy center dedicated entirely to empowering young African American women, teaching them exactly how to build their own impenetrable generational wealth and ensuring they would never ever have to depend on anyone else for their ultimate survival. 6 months passed in an absolute flash of intense construction and brilliant strategic planning. The changing seasons brought cooler weather, but the warmth radiating from the inside of the new center was undeniable. While I was busy laying the final structural foundations for the advanced financial literacy programs, Connor was sitting in a cold, sterile federal courtroom facing the absolute total destruction of his arrogant life. I read the highly detailed transcripts of his final sentencing hearing with profound personal satisfaction. The federal judge showed him absolutely no mercy whatsoever. He was permanently stripped of his prestigious corporate broker's license and legally barred from ever working in the financial sector again. The complex web of offshore accounts and the aggressive wire fraud I had meticulously tracked and exposed carried massive mandatory minimum sentences. Connor literally wept openly in the crowded courtroom as the judge handed down a severe multi-year federal prison term, completely destroying his arrogant corporate future. The federal marshals immediately placed him in heavy iron handcuffs and led him away. He traded his custom-tailored Italian suits and his expensive imported leather shoes for a standard-issue bright orange prison jumpsuit and a tiny concrete cell. Brielle was experiencing her own personal version of an absolute waking nightmare. Without Connor's stolen corporate money or Valerie's fraudulent charity funds to financially support her lavish daily lifestyle, she was finally forced to enter the harsh, unforgiving real world. My private investigator sent me a series of photographs showing her working a minimum-wage retail job at a cheap discount clothing store in a depressing suburban strip mall. She was standing behind a messy plastic folding table, wearing a highly unflattering, ill-fitting polyester uniform shirt and a cheap plastic name tag pinned to her chest. Her expensive hair extensions were completely gone, and her acrylic nails were chipped and broken from actual physical labor. She spent her long, miserable days mindlessly folding cheap synthetic shirts and dealing with angry, aggressive bargain hunters. She was completely cut off from the unearned luxury she had always felt so inherently entitled to. She had absolutely no marketable professional skills and absolutely no genuine work ethic guaranteeing she would be stuck in that miserable retail purgatory for years to come. She spent her breaks crying in the dirty employee break room, mourning the total loss of her unearned elite status. But the most exquisite and absolute poetic justice was reserved entirely for Valerie. Her complete social banishment was absolute and permanently enforced. The elite members of Jack and Jill and all the other prestigious historical societies had officially expelled her, completely erasing her name from their exclusive membership rosters. She was treated like a walking contagious disease by the very same wealthy women who used to drink her expensive imported champagne and attend her lavish garden parties. With zero passive income and massive mounting legal debts, she was forced to take a job working a cash register at a local discount grocery store. The absolute daily humiliation of her new, miserable existence was staggering. Wealthy women who used to attend her lavish charity galas now handed her crumpled dollar bills and expired discount coupons while she manually scanned their cheap canned goods. She had to look them right in the eye, knowing they were quietly laughing at her spectacular and highly public downfall. Her arrogant, aristocratic pride had been ground into absolute dust under the harsh fluorescent lights of the grocery store checkout lane. She was finally living the exact same miserable, struggling life she had always so viciously mocked other people for having. David suffered a much quieter and far more pathetic kind of absolute ruin. Late one Tuesday afternoon, I was standing on the second-floor balcony of the newly finished administrative wing of the center, overlooking the active construction site. I was carefully reviewing a stack of student enrollment applications when a slight shuffling movement down on the street caught my attention. David was standing on the public concrete sidewalk, looking through the heavy chain-link security fence. He looked completely destroyed. His shoulders were severely hunched, and his cheap clothes hung loosely on his frail, deteriorating frame. He had seemingly aged 20 years in just 6 short months. He stood there shivering in the cold autumn wind, watching the beautiful state of the art facility rising up from the exact dirt where his massive, fraudulent mansion used to stand. He was staring directly at the large, polished bronze letters that spelled out my mother's name on the main entrance pavilion. He slowly looked up, and his desperate, tired eyes found me standing high above him on the balcony. He raised a trembling, wrinkled hand, reaching out toward me through the cold metal fence, silently begging for a tiny shred of connection or a single ounce of forgiveness. I looked down at the weak, pathetic man who had stood silently in the corner and watched his cruel wife hand me a garbage bag. I felt absolutely zero anger and zero pity. I felt absolutely nothing at all. I did not wave back or acknowledge his miserable existence. I simply turned my back on him and walked back inside the warm, bright building, leaving him standing completely alone in the freezing cold. That brief, pathetic encounter only cemented my absolute final decision. The very next morning, I sat in the polished glass conference room of my legal team, surrounded by thick stacks of official court documents. My lead attorney slid a final heavy cream-colored paper across the smooth mahogany table and handed me an expensive silver pen. I read over the legal text with a profound sense of absolute total liberation. I pressed the pen to the paper and signed the document with a steady, confident hand. I was officially and legally dropping David's last name forever. I was legally adopting my mother's maiden name completely and permanently, erasing his toxic, cowardly bloodline from my future and my legacy. The name that would be signed on every single academic scholarship, every massive corporate grant, and every piece of generational wealth I built would belong entirely to my mother. David was officially erased from my life forever, and my real legacy was just beginning. The Legacy Foundation was a towering masterpiece of modern architecture, standing proudly on the exact spot where Valerie's miserable brick mansion used to suffocate the earth. The massive building was constructed entirely of reinforced steel and brilliant floor-to-ceiling glass, designed to let the pure natural sunlight flood into every single room. The grand opening gala was nothing like the fraudulent, pathetic charity events my former stepmother used to throw to stroke her own massive ego. There were no fake socialites drinking imported champagne and absolutely no stolen funds being funneled into offshore corporate accounts. The entire property had been completely transformed into a brilliant, shining beacon of financial empowerment and true community strength. Bright, heavy spotlights illuminated the magnificent glass facade, cutting fiercely through the crisp evening air and signaling a brand new era for the neighborhood. The massive main reception hall was absolutely packed to the brim with powerful, successful Black women who had traveled from across the entire country to attend the opening night. There were elite angel investors, brilliant community leaders, fierce corporate executives, and young, eager entrepreneurs holding their highly detailed business plans close to their chests. The energy in the room was absolutely electric, buzzing with genuine ambition and a fierce, unbreakable sisterhood. Professional caterers carried silver trays of incredible food, while a live string quartet played beautiful modern arrangements in the background. It was a true celebration of independent wealth, absolute self-reliance, and the complete rejection of toxic generational trauma. I walked slowly up the floating glass staircase to the main podium, looking out over the incredible sea of beautiful, determined faces. The ambient, respectful chatter of the massive crowd completely faded away as I adjusted the microphone and looked down at them. I did not waste a single second of their precious time talking about my past trauma or the pathetic, miserable people who had desperately tried to destroy my life. I did not mention David, or Valerie, or Connor, or Brielle. They were completely irrelevant footnotes in my history. Instead, I spoke passionately and forcefully about absolute financial empowerment and the vital importance of protecting your own peace. I looked directly into the eyes of the young, brilliant women standing in the very front row of the audience. I gave them the hard, undeniable truth about predatory behavior, using my extensive background in forensic accounting to break down the harsh realities of the modern financial world. I explained to them that sometimes the most dangerous and destructive threats to their personal financial security do not come from anonymous corporate boardrooms or sleazy outside investors. I told them that sometimes the absolute most toxic financial predators are sitting right across from you at your own Thanksgiving dinner table. I taught them that sharing a bloodline does not ever grant someone an automatic free pass to manipulate your bank accounts, drain your emotional spirit, or illegally forge your signature on a fake real estate document. I told them they must aggressively guard their financial assets, their professional networks, and their personal boundaries with absolute ruthless precision. I told them to lock their doors, build their trusts, and never ever apologize for protecting what they worked so hard to build. The massive crowd erupted into deafening applause as my words resonated deeply through the high architectural ceilings of the foundation building. But I was not standing on that stage alone. I gestured toward the front row and called Maxine up to join me under the bright, heavy spotlights. She walked confidently up the glass stairs wearing a stunning tailored suit and radiating absolute professional power. I proudly introduced her to the massive cheering crowd as the official lead legal counsel and the brand new director of advocacy for the Legacy Foundation. She took her place right beside me, cementing the unbreakable, powerful bond we had forged in the absolute fire of my initial eviction. We were an absolute powerhouse team, fully ready to fiercely protect every single young woman who walked through our massive glass doors. Maxine smiled brightly and waved to the crowd, completely ready to run our free legal clinics and teach these women exactly how to structure their impenetrable corporate entities. The formal presentation eventually ended, and the beautiful room quickly transitioned into a massive, vibrant networking event. Brilliant women were exchanging contact information, scheduling lucrative investment meetings, and actively lifting each other up into new stratospheres of success. I walked slowly through the joyful crowd, shaking hands, taking pictures, and feeling a profound sense of absolute total peace. The dark, miserable, heavy shadow of my past was completely and permanently gone. I had successfully purged the poison from the earth and replaced it with something undeniably powerful and pure. Near the massive glass entrance doors, a prominent investigative reporter from a major national financial magazine gently pulled me aside for a quick, exclusive interview. She had been aggressively covering my unprecedented real estate acquisition, the high-profile legal battles, and the shocking complete demolition of the $3 million estate for several months. The reporter held up her small digital audio recorder and looked at me with a highly serious journalistic expression. She asked me a highly pointed and deeply personal question. She wanted to know if, looking back on the absolute total destruction of my former family, the criminal indictments, the public disgrace, and the brutal high-profile eviction, if I felt any lingering remorse or hesitation. She asked me point blank if I regretted how things ended with the people who raised me and the father who had completely abandoned me to the wolves. I looked out the massive panoramic windows at the beautiful, serene, illuminated courtyard where the toxic, oppressive brick mansion used to stand. I briefly thought about David shivering pathetically behind the chain-link fence looking for a handout. I thought about Valerie scanning cheap canned goods, under harsh grocery store fluorescent lights, and Brielle folding cheap polyester shirts for minimum wage. I turned back to the reporter and looked directly into her eyes with absolute unwavering clarity and a perfectly calm smile. I told her I did not lose a family, I shed a liability. The grand opening event of the Legacy Foundation eventually wound down as the final guests filtered out through the massive glass doors into the cool, crisp night air, leaving me standing completely alone in the quiet brilliance of the main hall. I watched the professional catering staff silently clear away the silver serving trays and the live string quartet pack up their polished wooden instruments. The absolute staggering success of the evening was completely undeniable, and the sheer volume of charitable donations and elite investment pledges we had secured was easily enough to fully fund our aggressive educational programs for the next 10 years. I thanked Maxine for her absolutely flawless execution of the legal seminars and told her to go home and get some well-deserved rest after months of relentless hard work. I walked slowly through the empty, glowing hallways one last time, feeling the solid, heavy weight of my mother's maiden name permanently etched into the massive bronze dedication plaque near the front entrance. I stepped out into the quiet street and slid into the back of my waiting luxury town car, watching the brilliantly lit buildings slowly fade into the dark distance as my private driver navigated the empty city streets back toward my downtown penthouse. When I finally walked through the heavy reinforced wooden doors of my luxury apartment, I kicked off my expensive designer heels and let the profound, heavy silence of the massive space wash completely over me. I walked across the imported hardwood floors, over to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, and looked out over the sprawling, illuminated city skyline. I reached deep into my jacket pocket and pulled out my cell phone, placing it flat on the smooth, cold marble of the kitchen island. The glowing digital screen was completely clear of any notifications. There were absolutely no toxic family group chats demanding my immediate attention or my financial resources. There were no manipulative, desperate text messages from David begging for undeserved forgiveness or frantically trying to guilt me into paying his massive mounting bankruptcy legal fees. There were no frantic, sobbing voicemails from Brielle crying about her miserable minimum wage retail job or angrily demanding that I restore her stolen, unearned luxury lifestyle. There were absolutely no vicious, unhinged threats from Valerie bitterly blaming me for her humiliating public downfall and her miserable new existence working a grocery store cash register. The digital device was perfectly and peacefully silent. It was the absolute profound silence of a woman who had completely and permanently severed every single toxic tie to her dark past and forcefully reclaimed her own powerful narrative. I walked slowly into my master bedroom and sat down at my polished vintage vanity table, illuminated by soft, warm lighting. I reached out and gently opened the lid of my heavy velvet jewelry box. Resting softly on the dark, rich satin lining were my mother's vintage diamond earrings. They were the exact same priceless earrings Valerie had so desperately and greedily tried to steal and sell to secretly fund her pathetic country club lifestyle and her fake charity galas. They sparkled brilliantly in the dim lighting of the quiet room, completely safe and perfectly preserved from the greedy hands of those toxic parasites. I reached out and traced my bare finger over the cold, precious stones, feeling a deep, overwhelming sense of absolute internal victory. I had not just rescued a piece of expensive family jewelry or legally reclaimed a piece of stolen real estate. I had systematically and ruthlessly protected the true generational wealth that my mother had always intended for me to have. I had taken the fractured, broken pieces of my stolen inheritance and aggressively multiplied them into a massive, unbreakable financial empire. The millions of dollars I had secured were now safely locked away in ironclad offshore trusts and highly aggressive corporate investment portfolios, completely untouchable by the pathetic, weak people who had tried to consume my future. I closed the velvet box with a satisfying sharp click, knowing my mother's true legacy was finally safe and secure forever. The early morning sun was just beginning to peek over the distant horizon when my private driver pulled up to the international airport terminal. I walked smoothly through the automatic sliding glass doors, gracefully rolling my sleek designer leather carry-on bag behind me. The bustling, chaotic energy of the busy airport completely surrounded me, but I felt an incredible sense of absolute total calm radiating through my entire body. I easily bypassed the long, miserable, crowded lines at the main public security checkpoints and made my way directly to the exclusive private first-class lounge. I handed my premium digital boarding pass to the smiling uniformed attendant and walked into the quiet, luxurious space to comfortably wait for my long flight to a remote, private tropical island destination. I was taking a strictly personal vacation completely alone and completely off the grid away from the noise of the corporate world. I sat down in a plush, oversized leather armchair right by the massive runway windows and ordered a tall glass of fresh, sparkling mineral water from the attentive lounge staff. I unzipped my leather travel bag and pulled out my lightweight silver laptop, placing it softly on the polished glass table in front of me. I securely logged into my heavily encrypted private servers and pulled up the detailed real-time financial dashboards for the Legacy Foundation. The complex digital spreadsheets were an absolute masterpiece of elite forensic accounting and highly strategic, aggressive investment planning. The charitable foundation accounts were absolutely thriving, generating massive passive income through highly diversified global corporate portfolios and elite commercial real estate holdings. The center was officially completely self-sustaining and rapidly growing, completely immune to any outside market fluctuations or sudden economic downturns. I carefully reviewed the incredible, staggering numbers and felt a deep, powerful sense of immense professional pride. I had used my specialized forensic expertise not just to completely destroy the greedy villains in my personal life, but to proactively build an absolute impenetrable fortress of financial power for young women who actually deserved it. The polite professional voice of the gate agent echoed softly through the quiet private lounge, announcing the final boarding call for my international flight. I gently closed my laptop and slid it securely back into my leather bag, picking up my boarding pass and walking smoothly toward the luxury jet. I settled comfortably into my spacious, fully reclining first-class seat and happily accepted a warm, damp towel and a tall crystal glass of expensive vintage champagne from the smiling flight attendant. I looked out the small, thick oval window as the massive jet engines began to loudly roar and the heavy plane slowly pushed back from the terminal gate. As the aircraft rapidly accelerated down the long concrete runway and lifted effortlessly into the bright blue morning sky, a genuine, deeply peaceful smile spread across my face. I realized in that perfect floating, weightless moment that the ultimate revenge was never really just about forcefully taking back the $3 million suburban estate or sending Connor to a miserable federal prison cell. It was never just about publicly humiliating Valerie on the local evening news or forcing Brielle into a pathetic life of miserable manual labor. The absolute ultimate revenge was showing every single one of those toxic people that my massive, undeniable success and my profound internal peace were completely and entirely independent of their pathetic existence. They were completely irrelevant to my joy and my future. I took a slow, satisfying sip of my cold, expensive champagne and leaned back into my soft leather seat, looking out at the endless, bright blue horizon stretching out before me. I had finally learned the greatest and most powerful, undeniable lesson of my entire life. True wealth is not just about having millions of dollars sitting in a locked bank account. True wealth is absolute, total, and permanent freedom. The ultimate lesson from Iman's journey is that true wealth is not just about financial success, but about the absolute freedom to define your own worth and protect your peace. Toxic family members will always try to use guilt and obligation to control your future, but you owe absolutely nothing to people who only view you as an exploitable resource. Stepping away from a poisoned family legacy allows you to build something incredibly powerful and pure on your own terms. Your bloodline does not dictate your destiny, and your past trauma does not have to be your final story. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family to protect your peace and build your own incredible legacy? Share your inspiring journey of breaking free in the comments below.